next up, we have someone who's going to be talking about social impact and blockchain. He's a managing partner at SUSDev NYC, advisor to Project Forward, sponsored by Goldman Sachs to tokenize volunteerism, and Earth Ledger, using blockchain to resolve climate change. This is Jason Desimone.
So I know the market's down 90% and all, but the real sign of a bear market is when David, who's not here, hits you up about BION. 1,000 attendees, $200 a pop, all-star lineup, global expansion, and then you get a text a week later. Screw it, tickets are free, not paying speakers, but come anyway. No, but in all seriousness, I'm a huge supporter of the mission of BION, and I'm very excited to be involved at the ground level. So, and this overarching aim of expanding crypto and blockchain adoption to the masses, which we're going to need these that critical mass and these network effects for this experiment to really succeed. So it's very exciting. And I just want to acknowledge everyone who's here right now, especially during such a bear market where the promise of immediate financial gain is not that obvious, but you're still here to learn and grow and network and build. And I personally love bear markets, as Jay was talking about before, because this is where we really build the infrastructure for the next bull run. A lot of the scammers and the speculators have exited. The spotlight's not really on the space, and we can revert back to our core principles and the values, why we all fell in love with this revolution to begin with. So I think that's a nice segue into what I'll be discussing today, which is blockchain and social impact. But before I dive into that, I just want to kind of give a quick overview of my experience, my past, how I got here. So I've been in this space for roughly 4 years now. I've been across a bunch of projects in a lot of different capacities, mostly operating under the radar, but I don't have a tech background. I like to consider myself a generalist in more of the qualitative areas. And when you have an eclectic knowledge base and skill set and interest, and you dive down the blockchain and crypto rabbit hole, it's impossible to escape. This is the ultimate multidisciplinary field. In fact, the tech is the only deterministic part, but this is at a high level the convergence of economics, monetary policy, political governance, game theory, history, psychology, etc., you name it. And I really got drawn in by the potential of blockchain to create these new decentralized, trust-minimized, sort of borderless networks of humans, and the implications for disrupting traditional institutions. And this really drew me in so much that I actually withdrew from law school a month before classes started, much to the disapproval of my parents, but I was too drawn into this. And 4 years ago when you were discussing this stuff, people thought you had 3 heads, but it's, the good thing is it's become more widely adopted and accepted now. So where I really began was more in the political realm. So me and a few colleagues back in the early days were developing the framework and the concepts for what would become liquid democracy or delegated democracy. It's the whole notion that we can leverage blockchain or distributed ledger technology to fundamentally alter how we vote in democratic systems, especially with this wave of e-voting coming. And a lot of the framework that we created can be seen in some high-profile projects right now, like Democracy Earth. So that's where I began. Now fast forward to 2016, and we have the US presidential election, right? We have populist movements spurring up, popping up around the world. And amidst all this chaos, it became abundantly clear for the first time that we could no longer rely on the political sphere and governments across the world to really affect change at a high level. So if we were going to solve a lot of these pressing global issues that are becoming more and more pressing, we had to focus on the private sector. And whether that's because these governments are outdated or inefficient or corrupt, they just weren't getting the job done. So that explains my pivot to the social impact sector. Now, when I describe social impact throughout this talk, I'm referencing certain key actors. These will be like the family offices, impact investors, CSR wings, B Corps, donors, philanthropists. It's pretty much all the organizations contributing to social impact out of the public sphere. So now, before I dive into exactly how we can leverage blockchain, which is one of the perfect tools for social impact. I just want to cover some broad themes and trends that are emerging so that everyone could fully grasp this mass convergence of blockchain and social impact. So we're about to enter the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth in history. Baby boomers are passing down $30 to $60 trillion to millennials, rough estimates, in the next decade. Now millennials, we know, are one of the most socially conscious generations of all time, and they're twice as likely to invest in impact. We'll add to that that 30%, and this is during a bear market, mind you, would rather invest in crypto assets or blockchain versus traditional stocks and bonds. So we see this incredible trend emerging where we got all this wealth being passed down to a generation that is very passionate about impact and has bought into this crypto and blockchain revolution. One more trend I just wanted to touch on before we dive into the blockchain is this rise of impact investing. This is a massively growing field. So it's hit $500 billion this year. It's growing 120% annually. And pretty much what impact investing is throughout history, there's always been this dichotomy, this divide between financial returns and positive social and environmental impact. People always thought these were separate. What impact investing does is it merges the two in what's called a dual bottom line or double bottom line, which means you could get a financial return and create impact under one asset. An example of this would be like investing in renewable energy. So pretty much, besides trying to solve these global issues, one of the main reasons this is attracting so much attention right now is because it's actually been proven that impact investing in this day and age outperforms traditional investments. So like, even if you only care about financial return, it makes sense to bake impact into your mission. So with those themes I just outlined, what we see forming right now is this new impact economy. Yet you would think despite all these advances and developments, we would be well on our way to solve all these global issues and really affect change. Well, that's not the case. If you look at any leading indicators or key performance indicators or metrics, or like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 goals we're supposed to solve by 2030, we are way behind the mark. We are failing pretty miserably in the impact space. And that's due to a whole number of reasons. I'm not going to touch them all here just due to lack of time, but make a long story short, I'm going to touch on a couple of the key ones and then explain how blockchain is the perfect technology to resolve these shortcomings before we get into some more cutting edge projects. So the first trend, or the first obstacle that I want to talk about, is transparency. So in the charity and nonprofit sector in particular, this lack of transparency is pervasive. So you cut a check at the end of the year to a charity, to a popular charity, for a tax write-off, but the whole process is really opaque. You can't track like where your dollars are being spent, if they're going to the cause in the most efficient manner. One example I like to bring up here, which we were looking at when we got into the space, is in 2011, the Red Cross took in $500 million for the Haiti disaster relief effort, under like the promise they would rebuild entire villages. They took $500 million and built 6 houses and squandered the rest. And we were like, can you imagine if A, like this was made more transparent, but also B, if they were held up to the like scrutiny of a publicly traded company? Like, this should be unacceptable. So I think it's pretty intuitive how blockchain can help solve this transparency issue. We're talking about, blockchain is like the definition of transparency. It's a public distributed ledger that's time-stamped, that's historical, that's immutable. So a lot of the blockchain projects that are focused on transparency is in the realm of supply chain logistics. So you could start tracking like raw resources to end consumer, and every step along the way on the blockchain in a very transparent manner, and this could lead to value retention or impact creation along it. And you see like the UN and UNICEF contributing a lot of aid to like refugees in Syria and Jordan on the blockchain specifically in this transparent manner. One other thing I just want to touch on quickly on transparency is a lot of blockchain projects are specifically applying this to charities. So one that comes to mind is Disperse out of Consensus. And what they're doing is literally making charities more transparent on the blockchain. So you're able to track the flow of money from donation to output and hold these charities accountable once and for all. The second shortcoming I want to hit real quick that's really plaguing the field right now is a lack of reliable metrics to really measure and report on impact. And impact's very difficult to measure, just because it's very subjective in nature. And when you have all these different metrics and these organizations using different measurements, you could see the obvious problems. It becomes difficult to see which organizations are outperforming which. And when you're dealing with trillions of dollars, if we're not allocating these to the best organizations, we're squandering money. So I'm working a lot in this space right now. It's very complex. It's probably outside the scope of this talk, but at a high level, you can leverage the tokenization capabilities of blockchain to create these new investment vehicles that capture that double bottom line under one asset. So you could think of like crypto assets that are tradable between buyers and sellers of social impact in a liquid manner. Like I said, it's very complex, but the overarching theme is to use crypto and blockchain to make impact more quantifiable and measurable. So those are the two of the real obstacles that the field is facing that I wanted to touch on. And I could go on for hours on this. There are hundreds of projects in the space. I would implore all of you to really dive into this space. I think it's, I mean, I'm a little biased, but I don't think there's a greater way to affect change at scale right now than joining one of these projects. But rather than bore you guys with the basics, I want to just touch on some of what I consider the more innovative and cutting edge and really like forward-thinking categories of social impact. I'm working across a bunch of these, and I want to do this to kind of push the envelope and spark about imagination about where we can take this in the upcoming decades. So the first thing I want to talk about, and I touched on this earlier, is leveraging blockchain to create these distributed, decentralized networks that are trust minimized, that are borderless of individuals, specifically around proposals and solutions. So right now, if you look at solutions for a lot of these issues, these are created by governmental agencies or or policymakers or academics. But why not empower individuals to actually propose solutions to these issues, right? And through consensus and voting mechanisms, they could gain support, like sort of a marketplace of ideas that's open source. The best ideas will rise. And one project that I'm advising right now, Earth Ledger, they're creating these decentralized autonomous communities to resolve climate change. And it's, once again, it's about empowering the individual and really creating like new ways to organize. So now, once we have these communities of like-minded individuals, right, and these networks, we could now introduce novel fundraising mechanisms. So you could imagine crowdfunding or crowdsourcing the implementation of these solutions. So a bunch of projects that are doing this. Right now, Root Project out of Consensus, Earth Ledger that I just mentioned has a fundraising component, Align 17 out of World Economic Forum. And pretty much the goal is that once you've created these networks, they can now pool resources and to implement the solutions. Now consider the disintermediating power of this. Imagine going back to that Red Cross example I gave. If a community formed around disaster relief and decided that they wanted to contribute that $500 million to Red Cross, but instead of just giving it, there were stipulations attached to it, or criteria that Red Cross had to hit in order for it to be, what? Yeah, exactly. For these funds to even be unlocked, like from a smart contract. This completely shifts the power dynamic where now these organizations are beholden to the individual. So you're no longer just cutting a check and hoping they spend your money wisely, but you're actually like dictating where your money is spent. There's a lot of really interesting work being done in that space that's particularly exciting. And this last one I want to touch on briefly as we're wrapping up here. And this is really exciting. I think this is potentially the greatest form of impact. And this, I like to call, it doesn't really have a name, I call it user monetization. But it's this whole concept with this rise of AI and rampant job displacement, this income inequality, and all these universal basic income proposals. Why not find a way to use blockchain technology to allow individuals to monetize like their daily activities or their daily acts of impact? And these are people from all walks of life, developed countries, developing countries. So one project that comes to mind, actually out of New York City, is Blockstack. They're creating a decentralized internet of the future where you own your data stored on the blockchain. So now your Facebooks, Googles, and Amazons, they can't they can't just extract your data in these walled gardens and sell them to advertisers. Instead, they have to buy them off of you, and so you can monetize them that way. And it creates this contract. If they're not, if the service isn't holding up their end of the bargain, you just own your data and you migrate to a new application. So it's really interesting there, and almost everyone in the world has smartphones. So this is a way to really monetize your data. One other a project I advise right now, Project Forward, what we're trying to do is tokenize volunteerism. So like you could imagine a single mother who's not working can volunteer in her community, receive like social credits or crypto tokens that are redeemable by corporate sponsors that she can now like buy goods with or pass it forward to other nonprofits. There's a whole list of projects in this particular realm that are exciting. I'm not going to touch on them all. Once again, I implore everyone to really dive into this field, but I'll just wrap up with this one last comment. So at the end of the day, like if all that comes out of this movement is a transfer of wealth from old money to like computer geeks or just a few bull and bear cycles, then we failed to really unlock the full potential of this technology. Specifically as it applies to social impact, yeah, we're figuring out ways to allocate this capital at a global level more efficiently. But even more fundamentally than that, we're kind of like reimagining and recreating what value and impact even mean in this new economy. Or like how can we empower individuals, as I talked about, to affect change on the largest scale possible in ways they've never been able to. Or maybe even one day, like impact itself could be a form of currency, who knows? Thanks.
Awesome. Questions for Jason? If you could go.
Yeah, sure. The engagement of the communities, that was this way. Yeah, so you could imagine, we're still working out the frameworks for these things, but imagine a user proposes a solution, right? There are ways through blockchain where, through different voting mechanisms or consensus mechanisms where you could actually support that user. And if they gain enough support, that like mobilized community will rise above others. But this also allows people to vote with their feet. So you could, if you no longer agree with that solution, you can leave. And it creates this fluid sort of marketplace of ideas. So it's like kind of like a competition for the best ideas, which we don't have right now, and we need. So I mean, the specifics are a lot more complicated. I can talk to you about it after, if you really want to dive in. I know we only got a couple of minutes, but yeah, I'd be happy to share more about like the actual blockchain integration, if you want.
Yeah, it's very interesting what you were saying about sort of building consensus or sort of opening it up past current government type of structures to ideating all these things for social good. The one thing that kind of popped in my mind is that a lot of the problem right now with a lot of centralized governments like ours is that it's quite corruptible to special interests and industries that lobby and pour money into that. What it kind of rings a bell for me is that several years ago, a big part of digital marketing was getting likes on Facebook, getting comments, getting engagement on LinkedIn and Twitter and all these things, and essentially opened up the market to companies that would, that you, as a company that has such social media accounts, you could pay a company in India to like and friend your site and retweet and all these things. So it created a false inflation of activity to make it look like you were a superstar. Your company was very engaged, heavily engaged on social media. Is there a concern that a similar kind of falsified engagement could happen in a situation like using blockchain to ideate things like that could end up being a corruptible type of level of engagement?
That's an amazing question. It's something we're playing around with right now because there's two ways you could really take some of these you could there's two directions you could go with this. One is to anonymize it, where then it's literally like the best idea arises. But what anonymization allows for is some of the gamifying or the gameability that you were talking about. So the other way you could go with this is like digital identity stored on the blockchain, where like one user gets one vote, and it's very transparent who is you know, voting or contributing. So it's a lot harder to gamify in that way. But then that leads, crypto anarchists wouldn't like that because they're not anonymous. So it's a balance of the two. Also, anonymization leads to like, I mean, potentially some like very unscrupulous and questionable ideas to form, and potentially like dangerous networks to. If this digital world starts having more and more real world impact, which it will, you could imagine some of the like Black Mirror type scenarios that could form if you anonymize this. But it's something it's an amazing question. We haven't figured it out yet. And I know all these projects are toying around with those ideas.
I think a good response to that would be, instead of quantifying interactions, to qualify the interactions. Because say if you're selling your Ferrari and there could be 1 million kids in Cambodia that see it, but nobody has the money to buy it. So what really matters is whoever's in the network that's visible to your client base and to the niche group who you're marketing to. Because you just need one person that is actually interested in it and qualifies to buy it, to see it, rather than 1 million people that have no clue and no way of actually ever reaching that product. So to quality over quantity in terms of interactions.
Yeah, I would also, just to add to that, so when we're talking about like ideating and creating proposals and solutions versus like selling consumer goods, it's important to keep in mind too that the amazing part of this, of like a network like that, is that you would get to opt in to whatever causes you care about. I mean, if you don't have to like appeal to a certain market, the networks would naturally form around people's interests. So it's like the complete opposite of like marketing as we know it.
I think, sorry to interrupt, but I think like it goes a lot deeper into that. If you ever heard of like deep fakes and things along that nature, I mean, I think one of the ways that these issues can be tackled, and from what I've seen, what I've learned, is through artificial intelligence and just seeing the patterns of different algorithms being used kind of compared to likes, comments, where all these things are coming from, but at the same time using something like deep fakes, where you can have an endorsement from a celebrity who is endorsing your company but actually didn't. I mean, then you really have an issue. So and to tackle that, from what I've seen, it's really artificial intelligence is probably a great.
Okay, so you have a question?
I think it's right now to like something is free, you know. If it costs something to like something, it probably would be a better system just by using that.
Yeah.
Starters, the cost some crypto to like something.
Yeah, so that's so what you're touching on is like this skin in the game models, which we're exploring, and also through some of these voting mechanisms, you can get a scarce supply of votes. So I mean, if you're going to waste those on like BS likes, then go ahead, but you only get a certain amount. So.
All right, great. Thank you so much.